This episode is brought to you by Wayland Yutani Corporation, building better worlds. In the previous episode,
Michael Bay presents Explosions! Explosions from Michael Bay!
okay, nothing like this really happened. In the previous episode, we familiarized ourselves with the 4 Mitakon 50mm equivalents for 4 different sensor sizes, and took a look at their build quality and ergonomics.
Boring!
Now let's examine some further aspects, beginning with the reason why you'd buy any of these in the first place: the bokeh. As we saw in part 1, due to equivalence with regard to field of view and depth of field, the cropped versions work out to f1.9 and f1.4 respectively, whereas the G-mount version translates to an f1.1. This makes the classification from thinnest depth of field to least thin as follows. The 50 promises the thinnest depth of field, followed closely by the 65. The 35 lags a bit behind but is still respectable, whereas the 25mm is kinda meh. Shooting wide open is where it's at with these lenses, so let's compare how the bokeh looks like. As expected, the 25mm yields the smallest bokeh balls. The lens is very prone to flaring. Check for instance the top left corner. This isn't helped by the fact that it doesn't come with a lens hood, so if you're worried about flare, be sure to look for an aftermarket hood. Bokeh-wise, I personally find it okay. Off-center it has cat's eye shape, as you can see, and there is some notable magenta fringing at the outer edge. The 35mm, unsurprisingly, has larger bokeh balls, and it becomes much harder to make out what is in the background compared to the 25. Off-center bokeh balls are cat's eye shaped, but I personally don't mind. Also, there's less fringing visible on the edges of the balls. Overall, I find this to be a more pleasing performance than the 25. Flare in the top left corner is less severe than the 25 due to the existence of a hood, but it's still a shallow hood, so some flare does get through. With the 50mm, you're getting true f0.95 bokeh balls, and they are hella big. The background is turned into total mush, and it's virtually impossible to make out anything. You could probably have your subject stand in front of a garbage dump, and it wouldn't matter. More severe cat's eye bokeh is to be found off-center compared to the others, but the balls close to the middle of the image are pretty awesome and look almost feathered. Given that the 50 comes with a pretty sizable hood, the flare is controlled much better than the other two lenses, but still some traces of it are present. With the 65mm, the bokeh balls are slightly smaller than the 50, but still pretty big since f1.1 equivalent bokeh is nothing to sneeze at. Similarly to the 50, the background has totally dissolved, and the bokeh balls, as well as all out of focus areas, look silky smooth. Note that this is about as bokeh-licious as you can get on the GFX, unless you adopt a full-frame f0.95 for Leica M or similar. Here are all the previous images side by side. The 4x3 formats are a bit squeezed in this representation because they are not exactly to scale, but it's not unfair to say that the 50mm and 65mm have a certain wow factor to them. It is also evident that all 4 lenses have innately poor flare resistance, so be mindful of the direction of light sources, unless you are actively aiming for flares. It goes without saying that the hood will help minimize the impact. While we're at it, let's stop them down by 2 stops and see what happens to the bokeh balls. Unsurprisingly, stopping down by 2 stops makes the bokeh balls lose their roundness because the edges of the aperture blades now form a polygon. This is especially noticeable on the 50 and 65 because the circles are bigger to begin with. However, the 50 and 65 also retain a decent amount of background blur, so they are still usable for portraiture with sufficiently shallow depth of field. The 25 is equivalent to an f4 by this point and not much different from first party f1.7, f1.8 or f2s, albeit of course the image center has definitely picked up in sharpness in all cases. Close focusing ability is a trait I personally hold very dear. There are several benefits to a lens being able to focus closely. The lens becomes more versatile for everyday carry, travel and detail shots. And the shallow depth of field is more pronounced because the magnification is greater. As you will see, there are some inconsistency in the specs reported by the manufacturer and the actual experience with regard to macro capability. The 25mm has the closest minimum focusing distance of 25 cm and thus has the largest magnification. The manufacturer reports a maximum reproduction ratio of 0.13. The 35mm has the second closest minimum focus distance at 30 or 35 cm depending on the source, and consequently also the second largest magnification. The manufacturer reports a reproduction ratio of 0.13 as well for this lens, which doesn't make sense to me, but I might be missing something. The 50mm has a way less useful MFT of 50 cm, which is pretty poor as far as 50mm lenses go. Notice how much smaller the subject is in the frame compared to the two previous lenses. The reported RR is 0.1. Finally, the 65mm focuses only as close as 70 cm, which is like Leica rangefinder lens territory. The reported RR is 0.25. To be honest, I don't understand how they come up with this number. If anyone has an idea, please feel free to educate me in the comments. The subject is very small within the frame. You won't be taking detail shots with this lens anytime soon, unless you crop in a lot in post or use an extension tube. Once we put the images next to each other, the differences are even more evident. The 25 and 35 are way more versatile for close-ups. The 50 is borderline, whereas with the 65 you can pretty much forget about it.
Forget about it.
Forget about it.
Forget about it?
Forget about it.
Forget about it.
We've already got some idea of the rendering wide open from the bokeh section, but let's see in further detail if these lenses deliver where they are supposed to be used at most of the time. In this case, shallow depth of field portraiture. Special thanks to my sister for posing, even though she hates it. Before we delve into it, it's important to note that given the incredibly shallow depth of field of these lenses, wide open, especially in close distances, it's important that you have a good manual focusing technique or in-camera assists or both. I personally rely on focus peaking, and not all focus peaking implementations are created equal. I'd say that Fujifilm is by far the most dependable implementation out there. Nikon's is pretty bad unless you have a lens with electronic contacts, which then enables you to get focus confirmation. Otherwise, it's pretty hit or miss. The 25mm, given its f1.9 equivalent DOF, is a bit more forgiving to focus manually. This was my best attempt with the GX9, which has a pretty weak FP implementation in that not many edges light up for you to judge critical focus. I'm personally okay with the result. The iris is acceptably sharp compared to the rest of the image, so I wouldn't hesitate to use this lens at its max aperture. The background retains quite a bit of definition because of the increased depth of field compared to bigger formats. But for MFT, it doesn't get much better than this. The 35mm is also usable wide open with sharpness at f0.95 not being a total joke. Actually far from it. Due to the sensor size bump from MFT to APS-C, the background is now much less busy. You can still make out the tree branches, but they are far more blurred out. While not as sharp as first-party f1.4 and f2 offerings, this lens essentially helps APS-C approach full-frame results. The detail in the in-focus area is workable, without any perceivable halation. The 50mm is a mixed bag. On the one hand, the depth of field is another level compared to its cropped siblings. Note that the background is totally obliterated. It's almost like a lens with an apodization filter. There's nothing quite like it unless you happen to get hold of a Carl Zeiss 50mm f0.7 like the one Stanley Kubrick used in Barry Lyndon. On the other hand, the detail in the in-focus area is not great, partially because of my poor job nailing the focus, which is ridiculously hard, but also because of the innate softness of the lens wide open. Unless you're specifically aiming for the dreamy, soft focus look, the performance of this lens at its widest setting will leave you wanting. The performance of the 65mm wide open matches the 50 quite closely. The background is blurred as fudge, and the in-focus areas are quite soft. The detail on the iris looks marginally better than the 50, probably because the superior Fuji focus peaking enables the user to hit it with greater confidence. This is the shallowest depth of field you can get for a native G-mount lens without breaking the bank, but novelty aside, I can't really recommend it for its performance wide open unless you are, like in the case of the 50, doing soft focus work. Seeing all samples next to each other just confirms what we have already covered. The 50 and 65 have spectacular depth of field, but they are soft wide open, whereas the 25 and 35 are less eye-catching, but more usable at their widest aperture. Just for the sake of completeness, let's see how portraits are impacted by stopping down 2 stops. As one would expect, the sharpness gets a significant boost from stopping down, with even the 50 and 65 shaping up nicely. Obviously, the f0.95 appeal is lost at this point, but it's useful to know that you can get some solid sharpness by stopping down should you need to. Admittedly, no one is going to get these Mitakons to chew them at f8. However, it does make sense to test them stop down further to get a feel whether they can be considered general purpose lenses. In other words, should you have only one of them on a trip, can you also take a decent landscape pic with them? Just for the lulz, let's take a look at some landscapes shot wide open. Now, you wouldn't normally do this unless you don't have a tripod and you still want to take a pic despite the available light diminishing. As you can see, they're all pretty terrible, with the 50mm being especially horrendous. The corners are falling apart, both because of the innate softness wide open and because the content of the image there falls outside of the depth of field. Overall, wide open landscapes with these lenses would probably be an emergency case late in the day or at night. Now, onto the gist of this section: performance at f8 equivalent. It usually needs to be a pretty poor lens for it to be unusable at f8. At this point, I need to caveat the following section with the note that I messed up by exporting the images in these comparisons to 4K for 1:1 display, but zoomed in, they won't really hold up to scrutiny. So don't gauge sharpness based on this section alone, especially if you also take YouTube compression into account. However, you can still judge relative performance between the lenses. Overall, while the corners aren't really perfect in any of these, I wouldn't mind taking the occasional landscape with them if I happen to have them with me. Thus, these lenses are close enough to general purpose. Here are the prices these lenses went for at the time of purchase. Note that the 25mm was on a $70 US rebate. This 50 and 65 were noticeably pricier, but even at this price, the 65mm was still one of the least expensive options to get into the GFX system. And here are the current prices as of January 2025. Note that I had a hard time finding them in stock in EU eShops, while US shops like B&H do still seem to carry them. You might also have luck finding them on AliExpress. bear this in mind in case you'd like to order them from outside these locations, because you will most likely be charged import duties. The 25mm is even more expensive than I got it for 5 years ago. The rest have dropped in price, and I can say that none of them will break the bank for what they are. If you ask me what the most VFM pick is, I'd say the 35mm, because I find it ticks more boxes. Firstly, the price, the weight, the performance wide open, and the rendering. It's worth noting that since the introduction of the first Mitakon, the market for fast manual 50s has expanded greatly. On the 25mm front, you have options by Laowa and Voigtlander. The 35mm front is saturated with options such as Laowa, 7 Artisans, TT Artisan, Brighton Star, and Voigtlander. In the 50-something range we have Laowa, 7 Artisans, Brighton Star, and Voigtlander. And finally, for medium format... Never mind. Let's rank all the Mitakons on this tier list. Let me start by saying that none of these lenses is godlike, nor is any total garbage, so we'll be limited to the 3 middle tiers. The 25mm I'd rate as a based lens. The bokeh is nice for MFT standards, the price is okay. Stopped down, it can be used as a general purpose optic, and I especially like the great magnification for macro shots. Do try to get a hood for it, because it can't resist flares to save its life. The 35mm I'd rate as god tier at the time I got it, but admittedly it's showing its age. However, due to the great balance of weight, price, wide open performance, rendering, and stop-down image quality, as well as decent macro capability, I'd too rate it as a based lens. Get a basic Fuji or Sony camera coupled with this lens and you're in for loads of fun. The 50mm is the only lens out of this lot I wouldn't buy again. Awesome bokeh, but little else as saving grace. It's a lot of glass, so it's too heavy to lug around. Wide open, it's usable only for soft focus portraiture, and it can focus very closely. Overall, I'd give it a rating of forget about it.
Now forget about it.
You're better off saving for a Voigtlander or getting a used first-party f1.2 with AF. Finally, the 65mm is a tough sell. On the one hand, it's got amazing bokeh. On the other hand, wide open sharpness is borderline, it's heavy as fuck, and it's got one of the most ridiculous lens hood applications I've ever seen. If you don't absolutely need a native G-mount f1.4, I'd say give this lens a pass. Hence, it's a meh from me. That's all, folks. I once again failed miserably to keep this video short, but you know the saying.
Sometimes monkeys die.
If you somehow enjoyed this snooze fest, be sure to drop me a like, subscribe, and follow on Instagram. Let's get this channel to 10 subscribers or something. Or else.
Or else what?
Exactly.
What?
Right.